The sea was calm on that morning, and the air felt like it always did near that small village at the edge of the world. And the people of that place lived simple lives, and they did not know many things about the lands that were far away from them, and they did not know about iron cities or steam engines or modern wars or big nations that fought with weapons that could destroy many lives in only one day. And they did not speak about such things, because they had never seen such things, and they did not even think such things could be real, and that morning looked like any other morning. And the light of dawn was soft on the water, and the water was soft on the sand, and the sand was soft under their feet, and the smell of salt mixed with the smell of fish and wood. And it was the same old routine that every one of them knew since they were children, and the children of that place would grow up thinking the world was mostly like this quiet bay and this old coastline where the same gentle waves came in and went out every single day, and the men who worked on the boats pulled their nets and lines, and they laughed in calm voices and talked slowly, and they planned to be gone for many hours again, just like yesterday. And the women were cleaning fish by the wooden tables, and knives clicked against scales, and small talk rose like smoke in the air. And the older people sat near the houses, and they looked out toward the water, not because they were waiting for something new, but because that water was all they ever knew, and it was there like a constant companion that had never changed, and they never expected it to change, and there was never a reason to expect change, and nothing ever felt like danger in that place, because danger felt like an idea. Only children used for stories and legends, and they did not think danger was real for them. But then something different happened, because one young boy was standing on the rocks that morning, and he wiped his eyes and squinted out toward the horizon where the water touched the sky, and he saw something faint and dark, and he thought maybe it was smoke. But he was not sure, because the sky was kind and smooth, and there was no storm and no burning forest, and he stared longer and longer, and then his heart began to beat faster, because that shape did not fade away like a cloud, and it did not look like a bird, and it did not look like a simple fishing boat, and he kept watching, and he tried to understand it, and he finally told himself that he needed to run back and tell someone, and his steps were fast, and sand kicked up under his feet, and he ran past drying nets and fish, and he pointed toward the horizon with panic in his voice. And another man came out from behind the stacks of baskets, and he looked at the boy and asked why he ran like something was wrong. And the boy pointed, and the man followed the line of the boy's hand, and he looked toward the horizon, and he saw a thin, long, dark line against the sky, and he frowned because he did not know what he was looking at. And the shape remained there, and it did not move like a small boat, and the color of the shape was so dark that it looked like an unnatural cut in the horizon, and the man felt something new in his chest, and he felt his breath catch because the shape made him feel like something was wrong, and he did not understand why. And he called out to the others with a tone that did not feel normal, and soon more people came, and more heads turned toward that faraway dark shape, and silence grew slow and heavy like smoke. And the old men who had seen many storms and many ships and many faraway strangers in their younger days came out and stood there and looked, quietly. And one of them shook his head and said that the shape was not a whale and not a sea rock, and not a drifting island of wood torn from some distant wreck, because the line of the thing was too straight and too black and too sharp to belong to anything natural, and the boy who had seen it first felt everyone turn darker inside as the idea of the unknown pressed deeper into their minds. And then one woman whispered that maybe it was a giant creature rising out of the deep, and maybe the ancient stories were real after all. And another man said no, because the shape looked like a construction, and it looked like something that human hands had forced into being out of something strong and something very heavy, and iron was a word that only few people here used, because iron was a thing they rarely saw, and they only saw it in tools and small nails, and they had never in their mind believed that iron could be used for something large that could float over the water. And then someone said that maybe it was a volcano, but that idea faded because the shape did not move like smoke or dust, and that shape had a form, and the form was structured, and it was getting larger and larger in their eyes minute after minute. And the boy felt his bones shake because he could not find a story to compare that shape to anything else that he had ever known, and the adults could not find a story either. And soon the space around the shore became a place of waiting and breathing, and fear that did not have a name yet, and the shape finally grew clear enough that no one could deny that it had edges that looked straight, and edges that looked made, and edges that looked like they had been planned by some mind that wanted strength, and wanted power and wanted motion, and no one here had ever believed a human hand could make such a massive thing. and the water around the horizon looked like it bent beneath the weight of that dark form, and all the birds scattered from that direction. And that alone made people whisper new fear. And the old men looked at one another because they had once traveled to foreign ports when they were young, and they had seen wooden ships that looked like giant floating houses. But wooden ships still looked soft in some way like nature, and that thing on the horizon looked like something unnatural. And the old men finally admitted that they did not know what the shape was. And this single moment became a silent moment in their minds, because admitting they did not know was something rare, because they always had an answer, and they always had a comparison, but not today. And the boy felt himself trapped in a moment where time felt like it had stopped, and every soul on that shore felt the same way because they did not understand what the world was showing them. And even though they tried to stay calm, they felt the first deep seed of fear and wonder at the same time. And that morning that had once been calm and soft now felt like the beginning of something massive and unknown, and they all felt that their old world was about to change forever. The dark line in the distance kept growing, and the people who were standing near the edge of the water kept looking, and they could not stop looking because something inside them told them that this thing was not like anything they had ever seen before. And more villagers came down from the small houses that stood back from the sand, and more people left the cleaning tables and the drying racks, and some even left their cooking because the shape on the horizon was not something any person could ignore. And the slow movement of the dark line made all of them feel that their chests had become tight, because this shape was coming closer with a kind of purpose, and it looked like something that obeyed no wind and no wave, and yet it kept advancing with such a smooth motion that it made the old men shake their heads and the young ones blink many times, hoping their eyes were mistaken, and some of the women whispered that maybe it was a moving island, and maybe there was a world behind that horizon where metal was alive. And though no one could truly explain what metal even meant to them beyond nails and knives and small tools, some of them began to talk with fear, because this shape was too straight and too long and too cold in color to belong to anything natural. And one older woman said that she had seen broken wood from a wreck many years ago, and she said wood always had a kind of shape that was uneven, like the hand of nature shaped it. And she said that this thing they were seeing now was far too straight and felt far too perfect to belong to anything that came from trees or storms or drifting debris. And as the shape grew more clear, they saw that it had a color that was so unforgiving that it made their stomachs drop, because it looked like a slash of black across the blue horizon. And the boy who saw it first stood near the front of the group again, and his breathing was fast, because he felt that this moment might live in his mind forever. And he knew that this moment was the first moment he ever understood that the world beyond his small village was bigger than the stories told around the fire, and he wondered if maybe everything they thought they knew about human hands was wrong. And he was not the only one thinking this, because many of the adults had silent expressions, and many had hands pressed against their chests as if they were trying to keep their hearts calm and steady, because something in their bodies had begun to fear this thing long before their minds fully understood what it was. And no one moved away, and no one stepped back, because fear had covered their feet like heavy stones, and those who usually talked the most now stood with closed lips and narrow eyes, because this moment demanded silence and demanded breath, and those who once felt that they understood everything in their small world now felt like children again, because this giant dark shape had broken their confidence and torn open the thin curtain that hid the unknown world from their village. And a few men spoke in quiet tones about tales they had once heard about large machines that floated on water in other lands, and they had once believed those tales were lies or jokes told by traveling merchants, but in this moment those tales did not feel like lies anymore. And someone asked if this thing was a machine, and someone else asked if it was alive, and then someone else asked, how could iron float on water? Because iron was heavy, and in their world iron was the thing that sank and could never rise again if dropped in a wave or a tide pool. And so how could something made of iron, and something so huge and so wide and so long, float across the water as if the water itself had surrendered to it? And the more they looked, the more they realized that this dark shape had a deliberate shape and straight lines that looked like walls. And many of the adults whispered that walls belonged to houses or forts or prisons on land, and not on water. And if this thing had walls like that, then maybe this thing was like a floating fortress, and this idea made their blood run like cold water through their bodies, And the old men who once sailed farther than anyone there had ever sailed suddenly felt like they were faced with their own past ignorance because they had never seen something like this. And if they had never seen it, and they were the most experienced, then that meant this was something new and something powerful, and something that came from a world far away from them. And this world that created such a thing must be a world of great knowledge or great danger. And the villagers began to talk softly about whether this thing came in peace or in threat, and some whispered that perhaps the people inside that shape were like gods who traveled in a floating iron fortress. And some whispered that maybe those people in that fortress could destroy villages with only one command. And the fisherman who once feared nothing because the sea was his friend, now felt his knees weaken, and he sat down in the sand without noticing, and his hands trembled and his voice cracked as he spoke quietly, that this thing might be something that humans built for the purpose of war. And that word war was not often spoken in this village because war was a thing they only heard as a rumor from faraway traders, who sometimes passed through and who told stories of kingdoms fighting and ships burning and soldiers attacking. And every time those stories were told, the villagers did not even try to imagine them, because those stories belonged to worlds that were too large and too far and too full of cruelty to feel real. And yet now, in this moment, the idea of war felt real, and it felt real because this thing on the horizon did not feel gentle, and it did not feel peaceful, and it did not feel like something that wished to trade fish for cloth or spices for shells. Instead, this thing felt like a force, and forces were never gentle, and this thought made all of them stand frozen in stillness, and no one knew what to expect. And the wind blew through their hair, and it felt like the wind was warning them that this day would not be like any other day, and the sea no longer felt like their old friend, and instead the sea looked like a road that led danger toward them. And one brave man looked at the horizon, and he whispered that the world must be changing, and they must prepare to see things they never dreamed were real. And this whisper rippled through the crowd like a cold wave, and they all stood in silence because the unknown shape kept coming closer, and no one had the strength to look away. The closer that huge dark shape came, the more the people of the village felt like their old world was being peeled open like a shell that had always been closed around them, and every heartbeat in every chest felt heavier than the last heartbeat, because this long, sharp form on the horizon had grown so large and so clear that no one could call it a mistake anymore, and no one could call it far away anymore, and no one could call it a passing dream anymore. And those who wanted to pretend that it was something natural could not pretend anymore, because now they saw the hard edges of the bow pushing water aside in a straight and merciless line that did not look like any shape that the sea would ever design on its own. And the children kept silent because even they felt that this day was not like any other day, and that silence was strange because children never stayed quiet in that place. And this was proof that whatever they were seeing on the open water had reached deep inside them and demanded a silence that did not need to be taught. And when the shape kept coming closer, they saw that the front of the thing was higher than any boat they had ever seen, and higher than the roofs of their houses. And that alone made their blood turn cold, because height belonged to mountains and cliffs and to the trees of the deep forest, but never to something that could float. And as the waves bent around the advancing bow, the villagers could see white water spraying up against the shadow of that metal wall, and it was then that many in the crowd realized that this thing had not only size but weight, and that weight did not belong to wood or rope or anything that could be carved from trees. And then some of them whispered that it must be made from iron, and that small word iron sounded like a threat because iron was supposed to sink. But this thing moved as if the sea was afraid to stop it, and more people walked down from the higher ground, and more people took places near the sand, and many knees bent into the earth, not to pray yet but to steady themselves, because this moment did not feel like a moment meant for standing tall. And the wise old man with the scar across his cheek said in a slow voice that this thing was not built for fishing, or for carrying trade, or for simple travel. And he said that this thing looked like it was built to carry force and threat, and maybe death. And that one word, death, made the air colder and heavier, and no one repeated it, but everyone afraid of what it meant heard it in their own minds anyway. And the boy who had seen the shape first felt his throat tighten because he finally understood that the world outside his village could build things that looked like they were not meant to be peaceful. And he felt like he had just stepped into a story that future children would whisper about in dark corners, when the moon was high and the waves were loud, And he wondered if this moment would be remembered as the moment when his people first learned what the rest of the world was capable of. And he wondered if this moment was a sign that their old safe life had ended without warning and without choice. And then the massive shape came close enough that the villagers saw the surface of that black metal body, and the surface looked cold and still and perfect like stone that had been polished by a god. And there were no curves that belonged to nature, and there were no marks that belonged to storms, and there were no scars that belonged to accidents, because this shape looked like it had been crafted with exact purpose and exact tools. And the villagers understood that whoever made this thing must hold knowledge that they could not even imagine. And then the metal shape angled slightly as it moved, and the villagers saw some openings on the metal wall that looked like round holes. And they could not understand what those holes were. But those who had listened to travelers in their younger days had once heard a word cannon, and now they began to fear that these round holes might be the mouths of such terrible things. And the idea of cannon was not something they could fully understand. But they knew enough to know that cannon could destroy walls and destroy ships and destroy lives, and they all went still in their bones because they told themselves that if those round mouths were cannon, then this huge metal shape was a warship. And the word warship was never a word they thought they would see with their eyes, and as that realization spread from mind to mind like smoke spreads through a quiet room, all of them slowly pulled their feet tighter under them, as if they wanted to push themselves into the earth and hide from the truth that they were now living in a moment that would change every story they had ever believed. And the sea around the warship kept shining like smooth glass, and the sound of the waves was small and scared under that enormous shadow. And it was then that the villagers stopped speaking completely, because they had no words left that felt big enough to make sense of what they were looking at, and every breath they took felt like their lungs were trying to push away fear that could not be pushed away. And in that moment, not one person in that village believed anymore that their world was small and safe and isolated and protected, because the arrival of this great metal machine had shown them that the world was bigger and stranger and far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And as the warship cut through the calm morning sea like a blade through soft cloth, the people of the village felt that they were standing at the edge of something that was no longer just the sea, but the beginning of a future they were not ready to understand. And they all waited without moving, because they knew that the next moments would tell them if this warship was only passing or if this warship had come for them. The warship kept moving closer until it became so large in the eyes of the villagers that it felt like the entire horizon had become filled by this dark floating structure, and every breath in their chests felt like it was being trapped inside, because the scale of this thing was beyond any idea they once held of what humans could build. And it was at this moment that they finally saw those strange round openings along the side with clear detail, and the light of the rising day glinted on the rim of those openings, and they shimmered like metal teeth shining with cold intent. And some of the older men breathed out slow and shaky, because they now understood that these were cannon ports for weapons of destruction, and these cannon ports made this massive iron ship look like a thing that could swallow the life of entire towns in only a moment if someone inside commanded it to strike. And a whisper passed through the crowd that was so soft and thin that it felt like a wind moving through dried grass, because no one wanted to speak loud in case loud sound might anger this thing or alert whoever lived inside it. And the villagers felt trapped in a world they did not even know existed until this very day. And some of the children clung to the skirts of their mothers, and their tiny hands shook as if they could sense danger without fully understanding it. And one of the younger fishermen stared at those cannon ports with eyes that trembled like he might faint, because to him those round openings felt like eyes of a giant monster staring down at their village and studying them and judging them and deciding whether they were worth sparing or destroying. And he felt small and weak, because this was not a ship in the same way their small wooden boats were ships, and this warship was not made for fishing or for carrying goods or for bringing families across calm waters from one harbor to another, because this warship was a thing designed to show power and control and threat. And he understood this, not with words, but with a deep instinct, like an animal, sensing a storm long before the first drop of rain falls. And the great metal ship slowed its movement just enough that the water around it rippled differently, and those ripples reached the shore, and they moved up over the wet sand like the fingers of something cold and reaching out to touch the land. And one man took a step back as if the sea itself was warning him to flee, but his body would not let him run, and he stayed there rooted because he could not look away, and the silence of the group grew heavier and heavier, until it felt like the silence itself had become a new kind of sound. And then a new ripple of fear swept through them because they saw tiny shapes moving near the top of the warship, figures of men walking along the top deck, and those men looked so tiny compared to the enormous body of the ship that it made the villagers understand the scale of this thing even more clearly. And these small figures were moving calmly as if nothing unusual was happening, and they seemed to be going about their work in a routine manner, like this was normal for them. And this made the villagers feel even more afraid, because if the men on the warship were not afraid of being here, then maybe this world of iron and weapons was a common thing for them, and maybe they had seen many places, and many shores, and many frightened people. Just like this village, and this thought made the villagers feel like they were not special or protected or hidden from the world, and that their small, quiet world was not outside the reach of stronger and more powerful societies. And the faces of the children turned pale, not because they saw violence happening in front of them, but because they saw the possibility of violence in something that moved with such calm and casual confidence. And one of the older women whispered that maybe this ship was not here to attack but to examine. And this did not make the fear disappear, because the villagers did not know if being examined was good or bad, or if it meant they would be judged, or if it meant they would be ignored like insects on a rock. And some of the men imagined that maybe this warship carried soldiers who had fought in real battles with real blood and real destruction, and the idea that those kinds of men might be standing on that deck looking down at their quiet shoreline felt unreal. And yet it was real, because those small shadowy shapes were human, and they walked on that deck with casual steps, like they were used to walking with death beside them. And something deeper than fear sank into the minds of the villagers, a feeling that they were now part of a world too big for them, and too fast, and too full of sharp ideas and loud weapons and hard metal, and they did not know if they would ever go back to the simple days where the most exciting thing in the morning was finding a bigger fish in a net, or hearing a story from a grandfather who once traveled as far as the next bay. And the warship did not make noise like thunder, but it made a different kind of noise, a low vibrating hum that came from deep inside the metal. And this hum sounded like something alive, but not alive in the way birds or whales were alive. And some of the villagers felt that the hum might be the heartbeat of a giant steel creature. And even though they knew in some part of their mind that humans must have built it, they still felt that this ship belonged to something beyond natural human limits. And then the warship slowed even more, and the villagers saw something even stranger, because the men on the deck of the warship began to lift their arms slowly in a gesture that looked like greeting or acknowledgement. And some of the villagers almost stepped back and ran, because they did not know if the waving was a friendly gesture or a mocking gesture or a gesture that signaled some kind of future action. And they did not wave back because they were still frozen, and their bodies refused to move. And in that moment, their entire understanding of the world cracked like a thin shell, and they realized that the day that had begun like any normal fishing day had turned into the day when the rest of the world arrived at their doorstep and looked them directly in the eyes, and they did not know what would happen next, and they did not know if this warship would stay or leave or attack or ignore them. But they knew that their old life had already changed forever, because this single moment had destroyed every idea they once believed about what humans could and could not build. The warship did not fire any cannon, and it did not make any sound of destruction. And this silence made the villagers even more frightened, because silence from something so large felt like a choice and not an accident. And this silence felt like the silence that waits before something huge happens. And the people in the village did not know if they should be grateful or afraid of this, because they knew now that this metal giant could destroy them if it wanted, and yet it did not. And this made them feel like they were standing in front of something that was deciding their fate and not simply passing them by. And in that moment, the older men started to think in a different way, because they began to understand that this warship did not come here by accident, because nothing that size moved by accident, because something this big only goes where it is ordered to go. And they wondered who gave that order, and why this ship was traveling near their small, forgotten shore. And then they wondered if this was the first time the outside world had looked at them, or if maybe they had always been seen but never acknowledged, and they felt small in the shadow of such a thought, because maybe they were only discovering now that the rest of the world had been watching the sea for many years, and the villagers, were just slow to understand that they were not hidden at all. And some people moved closer to the water as if their bodies were being pulled by curiosity that was stronger than fear, because they needed to see every detail of this ship, and they wanted to trap this moment in their minds, because something inside them told them that their children and their grandchildren would ask about this day, and they knew that no one would believe them if they did not describe this giant iron thing exactly as they saw it. And as they inched closer, they noticed that the metal of the hull was not smooth, like one single piece, but made of many plates that overlapped like armor scales. And this made the warship look even more like a living creature that someone had built to survive the violent storms of battle, and the villagers had never seen armor in such a size, and this alone told them that the men who built this thing had knowledge of war that the villagers could not imagine in their quiet lives. And some of them wondered what battles had been fought on the far side of the world to make people think this level of protection was needed. And one old fisherman felt his throat grow dry as he realized that this ship must have been built by a world where danger was normal, and destruction was common, and war was not an idea or a myth, but a job that men did every day, and this idea made him feel sick because his world did not have such things, and his world did not need such things until now. And now this warship had arrived, and now the villagers knew that there were other worlds that were not gentle and not peaceful, and not quiet like theirs. And this one morning had destroyed the safe idea that their sea was an endless shield, and that their shore was a place that the outside world would never care about. And then suddenly, a few sailors on the deck of the warship waved again, and this time one sailor held something shiny to his face that sparkled in the sun, and another sailor looked through a long metal tube like he was studying the village through it, and the villagers moved back a little because they thought maybe these sailors were using some kind of powerful eye that could see into their very souls, and this thought made some people clutch their own chests like they were trying to protect their hearts from being exposed, and some women whispered that maybe these people on the warship were not looking at them like people, but like objects, and this made them even more uneasy, because they felt like they were being measured and studied and judged like animals. And the warship drifted even closer, and the sound of the low humming in its engine grew a little louder, and the villagers could feel that sound inside their rib cages like a deep heartbeat of iron echoing through their bones. And the boy who first saw the shape in the morning still stood at the front, and he had not moved at all, and his eyes were wide, and his mouth was slightly open, but he did not speak, because there were no words in his mind big enough to describe the feeling that this moment was pushing into him, because he realized now that humans can create things so large and so powerful that even nature feels small in comparison. And he wondered how many more things humans could build that he had never heard of before, and he wondered how many more surprises the outside world held, and he felt ashamed that he once believed the biggest thing in the world was the storm that sometimes shook their village, and now he could see with his own eyes that humans could make storms of their own, that did not need clouds or lightning or thunder. And this warship was proof that human hands could shape power in ways that were too large to think about. And then as time passed, the villagers realized that the warship was not slowing down to stop. It was not coming to anchor. It was passing. It was moving along the coast and charting the land. Not because the villagers were the goal, but because the coastline itself was the goal. And this made the villagers breathe differently, because now they realized they were not a threat worth attacking and not a nation worth warning. They were only an observation, a point along a map inside a world of nations that had power and technology and engines and guns and metal walls, and they were only a little quiet fishing village in the eyes of a world that had grown far beyond them. And the villagers felt like the little world they had loved was shrinking even while they were standing in it, because they now knew that what they thought was the whole world was only a tiny piece of something larger, and something violent, and something strong. And the warship sailed forward without turning and without pausing, and the sailors did not shout and did not call down to them, and did not lower a boat and did not send a message. They only looked and they only waved, and then they continued on their way, like the villagers were nothing more than one small scene in a long journey. And as the warship moved farther away from the shore, the silence on the sand did not break, because every person there was trapped inside the weight of a new truth that they had never wanted to learn, but now could never forget. And the boy who had been the first to see that dark line on the horizon now became the last to watch the warship disappear. And he kept watching long after everyone else had finally turned their heads away, because he understood that once a person sees something like this, they are no longer the same person they were before. And the old world he knew was gone, and the new world he feared had arrived and would never leave again. In the days that followed the passing of the warship, the people of the village moved through their lives in a slow and unsettled way, because even though no cannon fired, and no soldier came to shore, and no smoke rose from any battle, the minds of the villagers could not return to the old way of thinking, and their hearts could not return to the old rhythm of calm certainty, because the idea of what humans could create had changed forever in their eyes, and they understood now that the storm they feared was not only the storm of the sea and the thunder of the sky, but also the storm of human invention, and the storm of nations that built iron fortresses that could float across oceans like mountains held by invisible hands. And many of the older men sat by the water in long silence, and they looked at the sea with a different kind of respect, because it was not only the waves that could take lives now, but also the machines that crossed those waves, with the power to take lives faster and colder than any storm could. And the children listened more closely when adults spoke, because the children knew that they had witnessed a moment that grandfathers and great-grandfathers had not seen, and they felt like this day was the beginning of a story they would carry forever. And they whispered about the warship when no adults could hear them, and they asked one another if that iron beast would ever come back, and if the world beyond their little land was full of such things, or if this one was the only one. And some believed that many warships existed, and that the world must be wide and full of armies and heavy metal and weapons that could change the fate of entire shores in only 1 hour. And the mothers in the village cleaned fish with slower hands, because their minds kept replaying the image of the cannon ports and those round openings in the metal that had looked like the mouths of something hungry. And even though no cannon fired, the idea of the damage they could bring had burned itself deep into the thoughts of every person who had stood and watched that ship move with such calm power. And the village did not talk about this moment like a story told for entertainment, but more like a secret that marked the end of a chapter that they had not known was ending. Because yesterday their world had been a quiet place, and today their world was part of something large and uncontrollable. And this knowledge lingered inside them like a shadow that did not go away, even when the sun rose high and the sky was clear and the sea was gentle. And then something else began to happen, because some of the people who used to think they would never travel now began to wonder if they should leave their small village and search for the distant world that built such a warship. And they wondered if maybe there was something beyond their quiet life that they needed to learn or fear or respect. And a few fishermen began to dream that maybe they might one day sail far enough to reach a port where such ships slept like metal giants waiting to be awakened. And this idea was both exciting and terrifying, because if such ships were common in the greater world, then maybe their small village had always been living in a bubble of innocence. And maybe that bubble had burst the moment they saw iron float, and as the weeks passed, the image of the warship no longer hovered over the water in their sight, but it hovered inside their minds like a memory that refused to fade. And this memory made them see their own tools differently, because the old nails in their boats now looked like small pieces of a much larger idea, and the steel fish hooks that once seemed valuable now looked tiny compared to the metal plates they had seen on the hull of the warship. And the villagers realized that iron was not just something heavy, it was something that could be shaped and forced into strength and into size and into terrifying purpose. And no one could look at iron again without imagining the face of the warship and the truth that humans could force metal to do impossible things. And some nights the villagers gathered near the fire and did not speak very much, because their thoughts were too heavy to share. And the old stories no longer felt big enough to tell, because those old stories had always been about storms and old whales and missing sailors and ghosts beneath the waves. But now those old stories felt small and empty compared to the truth they had seen with their own eyes. And one night the boy who had been the first to see the dark line on the horizon sat by the shore alone, and he stared into the black water, and he tried to imagine what would happen in the future, because he now understood that the world was bigger than the limits of his village, and he understood that the world was filled with humans who could build things that changed the shape of the sea and changed the shape of human fear. And he tried to imagine if, One day the warship or another warship would come not as a silent passing shape, but as a force of violence. And he wondered if the peace of their little shoreline would one day be broken by the thunder of iron and flame. And he did not tell anyone what he was thinking, because he knew that the adults were already carrying this fear in their own silent way. And he whispered only to the water that the world had changed, and that he would never again believe that the strongest force was the sea. And he promised himself that he would remember every detail of this day, so that when people in the future asked what it felt like to witness the moment when iron itself became a floating beast, he would tell them that the sea did not roar, and that the wind did not warn them, and that the danger did not come with noise or fury, but with silence. And that once a person sees such a thing, their soul knows forever that the world is not small, and that innocence is only a word that disappears the moment iron moves across the water like a living weapon. And from that day onward, no one in that village spoke about ships that floated only through the power of wind, because now they knew that the world had entered a time where wind alone no longer guided the largest forces in the world, and the sea had become a highway for machines that could crush a shoreline without needing a storm to do it. And even though the warship had vanished beyond the horizon, the villagers knew that the world had become changed in their minds forever. And this knowledge lived like a line carved into stone that would never fade, even when the waves one day erased every footprint they had left on the sand. And the memory of this moment lived in every heartbeat that followed, because living in a world where such warships existed meant that the future itself carried a shadow that no morning light could fully remove.